Good evening and welcome to Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. I feel like I apologize for my absence a lot lately, but we have had a lot going on this fall. But I do believe things are starting to settle down a bit, and I'll be back to putting out new episodes on a regular basis. Now, it's November, as you know, and I just found out the other day that the month of November has been the month to hold the record for the most serial killers and mass murderers born. And I came across that little bit of information when I was trying to think of an episode for tonight. And I started looking into who might be celebrating like a birthday this month in the serial killer community. Now, I was shocked to find out that there's at least 17. So tonight we're going to be talking about some of those and possibly why so many were born in this one single month. Some of the serial killers we're going to talk about tonight have already had their own individual episodes, but we're still going to talk a little bit about them. Now, our first November baby is David Parker Ray, and he was known as the Toy Box Killer. And he was born on November 6, 1939, and the reason he was called the Toy Box Killer is that he had refurbished this trailer that he soundproofed, and he used it as a torture chamber and he called it his toy box. And this torture chamber had been equipped with BDSM equipment, sex toys, whips, chains, crops, and even surgical blades and saws. Oh, and not to mention a gynecologist type examination table. And get this, his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, she was his accomplice. And he would torture these women that he would bring to his trailer under false pretenses, and when he was done with them, he would kill them and get rid of their bodies. But one woman survived because she was able to escape. Now, Hendy had left the keys to the locks that were restraining Cynthia Vigil, and Vigil seized the opportunity to make her escape when it presented itself. Vigil unlocked the restraints and was on her way out, but she was soon found by Hendy, who tried to stop her. But Vigil stabbed her in the neck with an ice pick, and she made her escape. When she escaped the trailer, she was wearing nothing but a slave collar and a padlock chain. Vigil knocked on the door of a mobile home that was nearby, and fortunately the person who lived there let her in and they called the police. Soon, Ray and Hendy were arrested, and in interviews, Vigil told investigators that before the couple started torturing her, they played a cassette tape that detailed exactly what she would endure, and it was Ray's own voice that was heard on the tape. On the tape, he told her that she would only speak when spoken to, and she would call him master and call Hendy mistress. He went on to say that she would never see her family again because he would kill her like he had the others. When police searched the trailer, they found a videotape from 1996 that showed a terrified woman being raped by Ray and his girlfriend. As the investigation went on, it was found out that he had more help than from just his girlfriend. His own daughter, Jessie, and a friend named Dennis Yancey had also been accomplices. And in the end, it's believed that there were as many as 60 victims, and he was sentenced to 224 years in prison. He died at the age of 62 in 2002 at Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but his crimes took place in Arizona and New Mexico. Now, our next serial killer, he was born the next day, November the 7th, 1953, in Killeen, Texas. And he was known as the Sunday Morning Slasher. But his real name was Carl Eugene Watts. He also had the nickname of Coral. When he was 9 years old, he and his mom moved to Michigan, and it was only 3 years later that he started having these fantasies of torturing and killing young women. He was only 12 when he started having these thoughts, and it's believed he murdered his first victim before he was even 15 years old. Now, on top of all the sick fantasies he was having, he was held back a grade after he'd had meningitis and he couldn't keep up when he returned to school after that. And while he was at school, he was being bullied. And this was a very, very troubled young man. At the age of 16, Watts was arrested for sexually assaulting a 26-year-old woman named Joan Gay. And at that time, he was sentenced to serve time at the Lafayette Clinic, which was a mental hospital in Detroit. While he was there, evaluations did show that he suffered from some type of mental disability and his IQ was only 75. Evaluations also showed that he had a delusional thought process, and he was released in November of 69. He didn't even serve a full 5 months. Now, to me, it just seems that since they recognized that he had these mental issues, they could have just kept him and treated him. But no, they just let him go. He did go on to finish high school after that, and when he graduated in 1973, he received a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. But after he had been there for only 3 months, he was expelled from the school because he had been accused of stalking and assaulting women. He had also been suspected of brutally murdering a female student, but there just wasn't enough evidence to take him to trial. After all of that, he moved back to Texas and to Houston, and that's when he really started living out those fantasies. His typical victims were between the ages of 14 and 44, and he would kill them by either strangling them, stabbing them, bludgeoning them, or drowning them. But Watts was hard to catch because, for one thing, he didn't sexually assault any of his victims, so he wasn't leaving behind a whole lot of evidence. And another reason was that he was killing these women in different states. But he was finally arrested on May the 23rd, 1982, for breaking into a home with 2 young women in it. And while he was in custody, he was linked to all of these other murders. But the thing is, investigators didn't have enough evidence against him, but they had a plan. They offered Watts a plea bargain, and in that plea bargain, they offered him full immunity from the crimes if he would confess to the crimes and give full details, and in exchange for that, he would only be charged with the burglaries he had committed and the attempted murders, and he would receive a 60-year sentence. Well, Watts agreed to that, and he confessed to 12 of the murders in Texas. Later on, he admitted to killing 40 women and harmed as many as 80. And that was just in Texas. In Michigan, he was convicted for the 2004 stabbing death of Helen Dutcher, and he was given a life sentence for that. Then he was put on trial again in Michigan for the murder of Gloria Steele and given another life sentence. Well, 8 days after entering prison to begin serving his sentence, he died of prostate cancer. Now we're going to go back a little bit in time, and that's to November the 11th, 1859. And that's when Belle Gunness was born. We talked about her way back on the episode 3, and this is what I had to say about her back then. Female serial, or one of the first female serial killers I can remember seeing on the ID channel was Belle Gunness. So we're going to talk about her first. Belle Gunness was born in 1859 in Norway. She immigrated to America in 1881 in search of a better life. Shortly after marrying Albert Sorensen in 1884, the couple's store and home burned, and they claimed insurance money for both buildings. Now, not long after that, Mr. Sorensen himself died from heart failure. Bell collected even more insurance money because on the day of his death, Mr. Sorensen's 2 insurance policies overlapped. It's believed that during their short marriage, the couple produced 2 kids that Bell poisoned during infancy for the insurance money. I can't even imagine poisoning, well, really anybody, but not little infants. And all for greed, So after Mr. Sorensen's death, Bell married Peter Gunness, but soon he and their baby daughter died. Now, it's believed that up to 40 unfortunate souls died at the hands of Belle Gunness, including her adopted daughter, Jenny, and men that she met through ads and personal ads in local newspapers. Her ad in the papers read, "Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County desires to make the acquaintance of gentlemen equally well provided with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply. So basically, what she was saying was that she was looking for rich gentlemen that would put her name on their fortunes, and you have to also visit if you send her a letter. Now, apparently, she attracted a good bit of suitors this way. One by one, her victims were lured to the farm. At first, it was believed that there was up to 10 men that answered her ads, but later it was found more likely to be 20 or 30 men that she lured there. Now, soon after that, Bell's farm and home went up in flames. When workers were sifting through the remains of the house, they found four skeletons, 3 of which were Bell's foster kids. Now, it just floors me that she was trusted with foster kids because, I mean, who didn't suspect her of all the deaths that surrounded her? Well, it appears that a hired hand was assumed to be the culprit of this latest fire and the murders of the bodies found because in 1908, Ray Lamphere was charged with murder and arson, but only found guilty of the arson charge. After that fire, one of her victims' brothers became suspicious, and so authorities started digging around more on the property, and one by one, body after body was found. Now, before Mr. Lamphere passed away in prison, he ratted Bell out. It was assumed that the 4th body found was Bell's, but she had planned the entire scheme and had skipped town, but not before withdrawing all of her money from the bank. For years, there were alleged sightings of Bell. In 2008, a forensics team from the University of Indianapolis exhumed the remains of what is believed to be Bell's coffin. They were hoping to use DNA from a letter that Bell had sent one of her victims. They were hoping to prove that Bell had died in that fire, but due to its age, they couldn't use the letter to get the DNA. Then we have old Charles Manson, probably the most talked about serial killer ever, and he was born on November the 12th, 1934. There's not a lot we can say about Charles Manson that hasn't already been said. He basically masterminded murders in the 1960s. When he and his followers were caught, he was sentenced for conspiracy to commit murder and given a life sentence. He also died in the month of November on the 19th in 2017, and it was declared that he had had a cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure due to colon cancer. Now, I know there's a lot more that could be said about Manson, but there's this thing, and I don't know why I'm like this, but I have a hard time with reading about him, talking about him. I just feel sick. Like, I can see a picture of him and it makes me feel sick. When we were at the Crime Museum in Pigeon Forge almost 2 years ago, seeing his exhibit, it just, I don't know, it just did something to me. But, anyway, I'm just going to leave that right here. Well, moving on to another serial killer that we talked about on episode 3, and that was Kristen Gilbert. She was born on November 13th, 1967, and she was called the Angel of Death. Here's why. Not least, we have Kristen Gilbert. When Kristen was a child, she exhibited a very high scholastic aptitude, meaning she was one smart cookie. She even graduated high school at the age of 16. As she grew into her teens, friends and family started noticing that she would lie about anything and everything. She told her friends that she was a distant relative to Lizzie Borden. She also had somewhat neurotic behavior and started stealing from friends. She once stole a blouse from a friend. She showed up at that friend's house wearing the blouse. When the friend questioned her because she knew her blouse like that was missing, Kristen lied and said it was hers. So after high school, she attended Greenfield Community College and graduated in 1988 as a registered nurse. In 1989, she became employed with VAMC in Northampton, Massachusetts. Kristen made quite a name for herself early on in her career there and was even featured in the magazine VA Practitioner in 1990. She was the co-worker that would remember birthdays and would organize gift exchanges at the holidays. By all accounts and appearances, Kristen seemed like a professional at her job and was the social butterfly of the C ward. In the beginning, other nurses noticed a high rate of deaths on her shift, but they didn't think much of it, and jokingly they called her the angel of death. Later, though, they noticed the high number of cardiac arrest deaths and a diminishing supply of epinephrine, so they reported it to their superiors, and an investigation was started. Now, it's not known or clearly known what her motives were. It's thought that maybe she got a thrill or an inflated ego by setting up these emergency situations, because there was a high rate of cardiac arrest in this time period, and many of them survived because she helped revive the patients. There was even speculation that she created these emergencies to get the attention of a certain VA police officer who she soon had an affair with. It was the VA's policy that a VA police officer had to be present during any emergency that was taking place. Once the affair with the officer started, Kristen's husband was convinced that she was trying to kill him because he had started noticing that his food had an odd taste. One particular death of Kristen's that stands out is that one night Kristen asked her superior if her patient died, could she leave work? Apparently, she was anxious to meet up with her police officer boyfriend. The superior told her yes. Within hours, her patient had died from cardiac arrest. During the investigation, Kristen wasn't allowed to work, and the death rate went back to normal. Also, during that time, her relationship with that police officer began to dissolve. In the beginning, he kept her informed of what was going on with the investigation, but she started becoming more volatile as it became more and more apparent that Kristen was to blame for these deaths. When the police officer ended the relationship, Kristen overdosed on drugs and was admitted to a hospital psych ward. During the following weeks, her behavior became more erratic, and she even called in a bomb threat to the VA to try and halt the investigation. When it was found to be her that had called in the bomb threat, she was sentenced to 15 months in a federal prison. When the investigation into these emergencies ended, it was believed that Kristen was responsible for 80 or more deaths and over 300 such emergencies. When the case went to trial, the prosecutor brought to light that Kristen was having an affair with a police officer, and this police officer even testified against her, saying that she had confessed to at least one murder to him. Her defense attorney claimed reasonable doubt, stating there was a lack of evidence. The jury didn't buy her defense, though, and in March of 2001 found her guilty in federal court. And although Massachusetts doesn't have a capital punishment sentence, her crimes were committed on federal property and were subject to the death penalty. At the jury's recommendation, she was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole, plus 20 years. She's currently in a federal prison in Texas. I should also add that Kristen dropped her attempt at an appeal when a Supreme Court ruling made it possible for prosecutors to send. Our next November baby is Moses Sithole, who was born on November 17, 1964. Sithole was known as the South Africa Strangler, and here's why. He started out as a serial rapist in 1987, and the following year he got into a relationship with a 17-year-old girl. He was very mean to her, mistreating her every chance he got. In February of 1989, he raped her and threatened to kill her with a machete. She somehow got away from him, but several months later, she saw him standing outside of her new workplace, so she called the authorities. Well, when the police got there, they made both the girlfriend and Sithole sit in the back seat of the same squad car, which doesn't make any sense to me, but they did this while they were driving to the police station. During that car ride, Sithole cursed at her and even said that he should have killed her. Yep, right there in the police car. Well, for his crimes against that ex-girlfriend, he was given 6 years in prison, but he was released on good behavior in 1993. And he moved in with this woman that he had met in prison and her parents. Next year, Sithole started luring young women in with a promise of a desk job that didn't even actually exist. And by that fall, 6 women had been murdered in 3 different cities, and it was believed that all of these murders were carried out because he regretted not killing that 17-year-old girlfriend. That same year, the woman he had moved in with gave birth to the couple's daughter. But also in that same year, Sithole and the woman separated, and he became homeless. Well, after that, more and more women were being found murdered, and they were all within close proximity to a railway station that it was known that Sithole would sleep at. Now, a former FBI profiler was called in to review the evidence, and while this was taking place, the hysteria over these murders was growing at such a rate that then President Nelson Mandela went on TV and asked the public for their help. The following year, on October 3rd, 1995, Sithole called a South African newspaper, which was the Star, and gave a false name and said that he was the man that was so highly wanted. While he was on the phone with the newspaper, he gave them a long interview and admitted to most of the murders and that he hated women because one had falsely accused him of rape. And to prove that he was who he said he was, who they were looking for, he provided information with these clues about the location of an undiscovered victim. While this was going on, police were discovering that the women had all been killed after a promise of a job, and all of them had called a number which was registered to Sithole's sister. Soon they realized that Sithole's history matched with what the man had told the newspaper, and Sithole became a wanted man. His image was released to the media. It was everywhere, so the search was on. It all came to the beginning of the end of Sithole's reign of terror, when Sithole told his brother-in-law that he needed a gun to protect himself. The 2 men agreed to meet at the factory where the brother-in-law worked, and then the brother-in-law contacted the police. The police had an undercover detective pose as a security guard at that factory, and when Sithole arrived, he asked for the brother-in-law. Sithole got suspicious when the undercover detective refused to leave his station because he didn't want to lose sight of Sithole. So Sithole ran, and the undercover detective gave chase. When he announced himself as a police officer, Sithole attacked him with an axe. The detective shot Sithole once in the stomach and once in the leg. Sithole was arrested and taken to the hospital, where he remained in critical condition for 2 days. After he recovered, he refused to talk to police until he was visited by a female officer, and when he did start talking and giving details of the murders, he masturbated all the way through it. In the end, he was charged with 38 murders, and in December of 1997, he was found guilty of those 38 murders, 40 counts of rape, and 6 counts of robbery. For those crimes, he was sentenced to a whopping 2,410 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 930 years. And by the way, he's still alive. November 23rd is the birth date of 2 serial killers. The first one was born on that day in 1939, and his name was Derek Bird, and he was nicknamed the Cumbria Killer. He was 52 years old when he went on a rampage that started with murdering his twin brother and ended when he turned the gun on himself. And in between those deaths, he killed a family friend, a taxi cab driver, and then he turned the gun and started firing at random at different people. Now, the other serial killer that was born on November 23rd, he was born in 1945, and he was known as the British Jeffrey Dahmer. I talked about him back on episode 25, and his name is Dennis Nielsen. Between 1978 and 1983, it is believed that Nielsen took the lives of 12 people by luring them to his apartment, strangling or drowning them, bathing them, and then dressing them in fresh clothes. He would keep their deceased bodies around for a while and then chop them up, flush the small pieces down the toilet, and burn the larger pieces. He was found guilty of his crimes in 1983, given a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, and he died at the age of 72 while he was still in prison at the age of 72, which I already said. November 24th, 1946 is the birthday of the one and only Ted Bundy. Other than Charles Manson, he's probably the most talked about serial killer. He was a very handsome man and very charming, and he used that to his advantage in luring women to ultimately their death. Many times he would pose as being slightly disabled wearing a fake cast, making the women feel sorry for him and want to help him. Not only did he murder these women, but he also raped them. He wasn't in just one state or region of the United States. His crime spree trail was long and wide, murdering women from California to Florida between 1974 and 1978. When he was finally caught, he vehemently proclaimed that he was innocent, but the jury just didn't buy it. His actual number of victims is unknown, and he was executed by electrocution on January 24th, 1989 in Florida. Even though after he was arrested, he proclaimed his innocence, he finally admitted to more than 30 murders sometime before he was executed. Also born on November 24th, sorry about that, getting ahead of myself, was Charles Starkweather. He was born in 1938, and his notorious crime spree spanned from December of 1957 to January 1958. That wasn't really a long time, but in that time frame, he managed to kill more than a dozen victims, including the family members of his 14-year-old girlfriend. And at that point, he and his girlfriend went on the road and carried out 11 more murders. Starkweather was executed in a Nebraska electric chair on June 25th, 1959. The teenage couple's story has actually served as inspiration for several movies, including Natural Born Killers. Then we have now Rosemary West, who was born on November 29th, 1953. She and her husband, Fred, are known for torturing and killing at least 9 young women between 1973 and 1987. She also killed her young stepdaughter, Charmaine, who was only 8 years old in 1971. Fred was arrested on August 6, 1992, when he was accused of raping his 13-year-old daughter 3 times, and Rosemary was arrested at that time for child cruelty. But that case against them fell apart when the daughter refused to testify against them. All 5 of the younger children in the home were put into foster care at that time, and this brought to light the disappearance of their daughter, Heather, who had not been seen since 1987. When police searched the family's home, human remains and signs of torture were found, and the couple was arrested again in February of 1994. While they were awaiting trial, Fred told a social worker that Rosemary had murdered Shirley Robinson and dismembered her along with Shirley's unborn baby. The body of their daughter Heather was also found there. She was only 6 when she died in 1987, and she had been abused pretty much from day one of her life. Fred would never go to trial, though, because he hanged himself in his jail cell on January 1st, 1995. When Rosemary went to trial, she denied murdering any of the victims and told the jury her husband was to blame. She even said that she tried to stop his sexual assaults. Well, her stories didn't stack up very well against circumstantial evidence. The trial lasted for 7 weeks, and after deliberations, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict for all 10 of the murders she had been charged with. Rosemary was sentenced to life without any chance of parole. She was the second woman sentenced to life in the UK. The first was Myra Hindley. Now, it was also claimed in a TV documentary in 2020 that Hindley and West became close friends and even had an affair. And Rosemary, she remains in prison and is now 68 years old. Well, that's 11 of our 17. Now, others include the Golden State Killer, who was born on November the 8th, 1945, Billy the Kid, who was born on November 23rd, 1859, Gary Heidnik, born on November 22nd, 1943, and you might remember we talked about him on a What the Friday episode. Then there's Gordon Stewart Northcott, who was born on November the 9th, 1906, Robert Ben Rhodes, who was born on November 22nd, 1945, Adolfo Costanzo, he was born on November the 1st, 1962, Nanny Doss, he was born on November 4th, 1905. Now, reading that and doing more search, around, I found that there was way more than 17 that was born in November. And at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that there may be a reason why so many serial killers were born in November. Well, a 2005 study showed that those born in November grew up to be pessimistic because they believed they'd gotten a raw deal in life. So maybe it was written in the stars. Well, that's all I have for tonight. Catch me again on Friday night for an all-new What the Friday.